Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the Institute of Politics to tonight's forum. We have, as you well know, a very talented and effective defender of the environment and a champion of economic justice. Robert F. Kennedy was educated here at Harvard University. He studied at the London School of Economics. He got his LLB at Virginia Law School and got a master's degree in environmental law from Pace University Law School. He's been very successful in a number of endeavors, and I'll only mention a couple so that you actually spend time with him, not with the introduction. But in particular, he's been very effective in protecting the Hudson River and the Long Island Sound, in gaining access to the shoreline for all of our citizens in terms of working to protect the water supply of New York. And he's been very helpful to indigenous tribes in Canada and Latin America in terms of protecting their homelands. He currently is a prosecuting attorney for the Hudson River Keepers. He's a senior attorney for the Natural Resource Defense Council, better known as the NRDC to most of us, and he is a professor of environmental litigation at the environmental clinic at Pace University School of Law, where he's helping to train others to do the same. And as if you've read anything about him, you know he has many, many interests, but two that are particularly stand out is he's a licensed master falconer, which I suspect has helped him deal with some of the vultures, the human vultures, that he's had to take on. And he's also a whitewater paddling enthusiast, going to many esoteric and interesting places. Ladies and gentlemen, Robert F. Kennedy, Jr.
Thank you. Thank you, Phil. It looks like a nice crowd. It's mainly my family. I'm really happy to be here at Harvard, and I'm happy to be here among so many good friends. I was in the cab coming in here today, and this happens I live in New York, and every time I come to Massachusetts, I run into a lot of family and a lot of old family friends, but when I was getting off the plane, somebody recognized me, and they said, "I knew your father," and which is every other person when I come to Massachusetts seems to have a memory, which is really a wonderful thing for me and all the members of my family. But all of my life I've had this happen where wherever I go, people say you're Bobby's son, or you're Ted's nephew, or you're Jack's nephew, or you're Joe's brother. Or I go to Maryland now where my sister's lieutenant governor, and they say you're Kathleen's brother. But I was on the West Coast a couple of weeks ago speaking at a college out there, and afterwards some of the students came up to me and they said, "Oh, you're Arnold's cousin." So that was a new one. But I have a lot of friends here. One person I wanted to recognize is Bill Taylor, who's a great figure in this community, but has been working on the campaign for the Water's Edge, which is going to restore public access. It's a grassroots movement to restore public access in Quincy and Chelsea and along Boston Harbor. And to me, really, that's what that epitomizes what the environmental movement, what environmental advocacy is about, which is not advocating so much on behalf of fishes and birds and waterways, but it's an advocacy for community. And to me, that's all that we do. It's about community. It's about the question of the environment, which so many people try to compartmentalize and say it's over here, and the jobs and recreation and civil rights and human rights are over here. They're intertwined, and you can't separate one from the other. And the question of what kind of environment do we want is the same question that people ask when they ask what kind of schools do I want my children to go to, what kind of quality air and water do we want for our children, what kind of recreational opportunities and enrichment do we want? And that's what it's about. The group that I work for, a large national organization. I work for two groups. One is called the Natural Resource Defense Council, which is a large national environmental group. But I came into this kind of work, and I remain at a group that is now called Riverkeeper. It used to be called the Hudson River Fishermen's Association when I first started working there. And I still spend 80% of my time doing work for the keeper, for the river keeper on the Hudson, and for the other keepers around the country. And this was a group that was founded in 1966 by a group of commercial and recreational fishermen and we have one of the oldest commercial fisheries in the United States on the Hudson River. It's 350 years old. Many of the people I represent come from families that have been fishing the river continuously since Dutch colonial times. It's a traditional gear fishery. They use the same fishing methods, the ash poles, the gill nets, the little boats, open boats, that were taught by the Algonquin Indians to the original Dutch settlers of New Amsterdam, passed down generation to generation. And one of the enclaves of the commercial fishery on the Hudson River is a little town called Crotonville, New York. And this is a blue-collar village. The people who live there are not your prototypical kind of pipe-smoking, tweed-jacketed environmentalists who are trying to preserve distant wilderness areas in Wyoming or Montana. They were factory workers, carpenters, lathers, electricians. Most of the people, really nobody in this town in 1966 had any expectation that they would ever take their families to see Yosemite or Yellowstone or the Everglades or any of the national parks. They had no public parks or swimming pools or playgrounds in Crotonville. For the people who lived there, the environment was their backyard. It was the bathing beaches, the fishing holes, the swimming holes of the Hudson River. Richie Garrett, who was the first president of the Fishermen's Association, used to say about the Hudson, it's our Riviera, it's our Monte Carlo. Richie Garrett was a gravedigger from Ossining, New York. He used to tell his new followers, I'll be the last to let you down. But in 1966, Penn Central Railroad began vomiting oil from a 4.5-foot pipe. And that oil came up the Croton River on the tides. It blackened the beaches. It made the shad taste of diesel so that they couldn't be sold down at the South Street Seaport. And all of the people in Crotonville came together in a room really about this size, the only public building in Crotonville, New York, which is a Parker Bale American Legion Hall. And this is a very patriotic community. In fact, Ossining, the town in which Crotonville sits, had one of the highest mortality rates of any towns in the United States during World War II. Most of the original officers and founders and board members were ex-Marines. They're combat veterans from World War II and Korea. Richie Garrett was an ex-Marine. These weren't radicals or militants. Their patriotism was rooted in the bedrock of this country. But that night they started talking about violence. And it was because they saw something that they thought they owned, which was the fisheries of the Hudson River, the fish and the water and the beaches. And it was being taken away from them by corporate entities over whom they had no control. And they had been to the Conservation Department, and they had been to the Corps of Engineers, they'd been to government agencies, the Coast Guard, and they had been given the bum's rush. The Corps colonel told Richie Garrett after dozens of visits trying to get him to shut down the Penn Central pipe, these are important people. Speaking of the Penn Central Board of Directors, we can't treat them that way. And the people in this village had become convinced that government was in cahoots with the polluters, and that the only way they were going to reclaim the Hudson for themselves is if they confronted the polluters directly. And somebody suggested, they went around the room talking about the river and how much it meant to them and their families, and somebody suggested that they put a match to the oil slick at the Penn Central pipe and blow it up. And somebody else said that they should jam a mattress up the pipe and flood the rail yard with its own waste. And somebody else suggested that they float a raft of dynamite into the intake of the Indian Point power plant and blow it up. At that point, Indian Point was killing 1 million fish a day on its intake screens and taking food off their family tables. And then a guy stood up whose name was Bob Boyle, and he was another Marine. He was, at that time, the outdoor editor for Sports Illustrated magazine, and he still is today. He's been there for 45 years. And he was a great fly fisherman. He was one of the gurus of dry fly fishing in this country. He'd written 6 books on fishing. And 2 years before, he had written an article about angling in the Hudson River for Sports Illustrated. And in researching that article, he had come across an ancient navigational statute called the 1888 Rivers and Harbors Act. And that statute said that it was illegal to pollute any water body in the United States, and that you had to pay a high penalty if you got caught polluting. But also there was a bounty provision that said that anybody who turned in the polluter got to keep half the fine. And he had sent a copy of this over to the libel lawyers at Time Inc., and he had said, is this still good law? And they had written him back a memo that said it has never in 80 years been enforced, that bounty provision, and yet it's still on the books and it's still good law. And that night, he arrived at this meeting when all these men were talking about violence, and he stood up with the copy of this law, which he passed out, and he said, you know, we shouldn't be talking about breaking the law, we should be talking about enforcing it. And they resolved that night that they were going to start a group that was at that point called the Hudson River Fishermen's Association, and that they were going to go out and track down and prosecute every polluter on the Hudson River. 18 months later, they collected the first bounty in United States history under the Rivers and Harbors Act, They got $2,000. They shut down the Penn Central Pipe. There's a huge amount of money in Crotonville, New York in 1968. There was 2 weeks of wild celebration in the town, and they used the money that was left over to go after Ciba-Geigy and Standard Brands and the New York National Guard for filling a wetland up in Peekskill, and Westchester County for operating a dump illegally on Croton Point. In 1971, they collected the highest penalty in United States history against a corporate polluter. They got $200,000 from Anaconda Wire and Copper. And they used the money from these winnings to construct a boat, which they called the Riverkeeper, which today patrols the Hudson. In 1983, they hired, for the first time, a full-time riverkeeper, a former commercial fisherman named John Cronin. And he hired me a year later as a full-time prosecuting attorney. And since that time, we actually, a year after that, we founded at Pace Law School in White Plains, New York, which is a law school that specializes in environmental law, a litigation clinic, an environmental litigation clinic, where I and my partner, Carl Copeland, supervise 10 students, third-year law students, who by a special court order are permitted to practice law under our supervision as if they were attorneys. They can do anything a lawyer can do. We give them each 3 or 4 polluters to sue at the beginning of the semester. They file complaints. They do discovery. They do depositions. They go to court. They argue their cases. Of course, if they don't win the case, they don't pass the course. And we have, since we started the clinic, we have brought over 150 successful legal actions against Hudson River polluters. We forced polluters to spend well over $1 billion on remediation of the river. And today, as a result of our work and the work of Scenic Hudson, Clearwater, the other environmental groups, the Hudson River is an international success story. It's a river that was dead for 20-mile stretches in 1966, is today a model for ecosystem protection. It's the richest water body today in the North Atlantic. It produces more biomass per gallon, more pounds of fish per acre than any other river system in the North Atlantic. And it's the last major river system left on the east coast of North America, the west coast of Europe, and I'll throw in the Mediterranean and the Aegean, the Adriatic, the Black Sea, the Baltic Sea, the Marmara, the Dardanelles. Of all the rivers that feed those water bodies, there's only one left that still has strong spawning stocks of all of its historical species of migratory fish, and that's the Hudson River. It's Noah's Ark. It's a species warehouse. Now, because of our success on the Hudson, the Riverkeeper system has now spread across the country. We actually own the Keeper name, and we license it out to groups that are trying to get started. I went out with my family and launched a Cook Inlet Keeper in Alaska this summer. We have keepers on Puget Sound, San Francisco Bay, Santa Monica Bay, the Tualatin, the Willamette, and most of the major river systems on the East Coast, from Casco Bay in Maine all the way down to the St. John in Florida. And I have back in my office over 100 applications for new keepers. We're processing them as fast as we can. We have 34 programs now around the country. And I look forward to the day, which I hope will be very soon, when we have keepers on every major river across America, including the Charles and Boston Harbor, protecting the community's interest in that water body. I love my job. I love it. I love the fishermen, the people that I work with. I love being out on the water. I love going to court and fighting against the bad guys, and I like teaching. A couple of years ago, my clients asked me to do something that I never really wanted to do, which was to spend a lot of time in Washington, D.C., lobbying against the anti-environmental provisions of, at that point, the 104th Congress, and subsequently the 105th and 106th, which have been the most anti-environmental Congresses in our country's history. And I have to say this, I work for fishermen. They come from the range of the political spectrum, from right-wing Republicans to left-wing Democrats. Sometimes I go out with them on the river, or I go to the bait shacks after they, at the end of the day, and listen to them talk. Sometimes it's scary, some of the stuff that they say, their worldview. But without exception, they saw what was happening in Capitol Hill since 1994 as the gravest threat, not only to their livelihood, but to their basic values, to their core values, and their ideas of what it means to be an American. And they were right. If the laws that have passed Capitol Hill, have passed Congress, or come out of committee in every session of Congress during the last, since 1994, had actually been signed into law by the president in any particular session of Congress you want to pick, we would have no significant federal environmental law left in this country. And that's not exaggeration. That is not hyperbole. That is a fact. And many of our laws would have remained on the books in one form or the other, but they would be unenforceable. And it would be like Mexico, which has wonderful environmental laws, better than we have in many cases, but nobody enforces them, and therefore nobody complies with them. The original attack of the 104th Congress was a direct assault, where people came in and rewrote the Clean Water Act to remove all federal protection from wetlands and to lift many of the restrictions for dumping toxics and sewage into our nation's waterways. Rewrote the Endangered Species Act so species would only receive protection from extinction if they could demonstrate a current economic value that exceeded the immediate financial benefits of exterminating them, and so on and so on. And the next session, by March of '95, we had turned them back, and they turned into a stealth attack. And that's what it's been like ever since, with they coming at us with these super mandates, these so-called takings bills, Private Property Protection Act, which pretend to enhance the protection of private property as a platitude that every American can embrace, but what they really do is give constitutional protection to the right to pollute. Regulatory reform bills, so-called, again, that again promise Americans that they're going to lift the burden of regulation, but if you read the fine print, what they actually do is they give veto power to large corporations over all of our environmental health and safety laws. And then riders. In each session of Congress, dozens and dozens of these terrible riders that they sneak in by attaching them to the budget bills where they won't receive public scrutiny, they're not debated, they go right through Congress without public debate, and because they know they can't withstand the public debate, but they attach them, and they're designed to destroy our environmental laws. Now, if you ask the people on Capitol Hill who are promoting this kind of legislation, why are you doing this? What they invariably will say is, and this is what I spent the last couple of years doing, is asking these people this question. What they invariably say is, well, the time has come in our nation's history where we have to choose now between economic prosperity on the one hand and environmental protection on the other. And that is a false choice. In 100% of the situations, good environmental policy is identical to good economic policy. If we want to measure our economy, and this is how we ought to be measuring it, based upon how it produces jobs and the dignity of jobs over the generations. If, on the other hand, we want to do what they are urging us to do on Capitol Hill still, which is to treat the planet as if it were a business in liquidation, to convert our natural resources to cash as quickly as possible, to have a few years of pollution-based prosperity, we can generate an instantaneous cash flow and the illusion of a prosperous economy. But our children are going to pay for our joyride, and they're going to pay for it with denuded landscapes and huge cleanup costs and poor health that they simply won't be able to afford. Environmental injury is deficit spending. It's a way of shifting the price of our generation's prosperity onto the backs of our children, who don't have a role in the democratic process because they're not around to participate yet. And if you don't believe that, those costs, look at the nations that didn't make an investment in the environment back in the 70s the way that we did. All of our environmental investment began on Earth Day 1970 in this country. And I remember what it was like before Earth Day. I remember the Cuyahoga River burning for a week and nobody being able to put it out. I remember when Lake Erie was declared dead, no life in it whatsoever that breathed oxygen. I remember that I couldn't swim in the Hudson or the Charles or the Potomac when I was growing up. I remember what Washington, D.C. smelled like when I was a boy. It stank, and it wasn't an industrial city. We called K Street Smelly Bridge Road, because and some days you couldn't see down the block because of the smog. We had thousands of Americans dying in our cities during the 60s. People don't remember this today. You talk to these young congressmen on Capitol Hill, they have no memory of what it was like before Earth Day and of the benefits that those laws have brought to this country. When I was a boy, Phil mentioned that I'm a falconer, and I've been training hawks since I was 11 years old. I always was interested in hawks and falcons from when I was little. When I was 9 or 10 years old, we would go down to Washington, with 8 or 9 of my brothers and sisters, down to my father's office, the Justice Department, for lunch, or go to see my uncle at the White House. And we could look up at that, when I was a boy, I could look up Pennsylvania Avenue, the old post office building in Washington, D.C., and there was a pair of eastern and Adams peregrines nesting on the roof of that, which were the most spectacular predatory bird we had in this country. It was salmon pink. They had a beautiful white coverlet on their nair, and they could fly over 200 miles an hour. There was a pair nesting in the cupola of the old post office, and I could watch them come off the roof at those speeds, fly up Pennsylvania Avenue, and pick pigeons out of the air 40 feet above the heads of the pedestrians and then fly back to the post office. And for me, seeing a site like that was more spectacular, exciting than visiting my uncle at the White House. But my children will never see that site because that bird went extinct in 1963 from DDT poisoning. And we do have peregrines back here in Boston and New York, but they're nowhere near the bird that we lost here. And they're a hybridized bird that was bred in captivity and then released into the wild, the ones that you see in Boston. And that bird is gone for good, 175 million years of evolution. And that accumulation of insults in 1970 drove 20 million Americans out onto the street, 10% of our population, the largest public demonstration in United States history, demanding that our political leaders return to Americans the ancient environmental rights that had been taken from our people during the previous 80 years. And the government responded. Republicans and Democrats got together. Nixon created EPA, signed many of these laws into effect, and they created this extraordinary body, 19 major statutes that were passed over the next 10 years to protect our air and our water and our endangered species and wetlands and the safety of our food supply. And those laws, in many ways, have become the model for 100 other nations around the world who have had their own versions of Earth Day and copied our laws. But there's some nations that didn't do that. They didn't have an Earth Day, and they didn't make that investment, and look what's become of them. Look at the former Soviet Union, where they didn't have any environmental laws. And they didn't have NEPA, for example, which was our first law. It's passed in 1969. That's the law that requires government to do an environmental impact analysis before it disposes of publicly owned resources that are important. They didn't have that in the Soviet Union, and because of that, the Aral Sea in Russia, which is the largest inland freshwater body on Earth after the Great Lakes, is now a desert. They didn't have a Clean Water Act, and the Sea of Azov in Russia, which was the richest fishery on Earth after the Chesapeake Bay, is now a biological wasteland. They didn't have nuclear regulatory review requirements like we have in this country, and because of that, 1/5 of Belarusia, a state larger than Massachusetts, is now permanently uninhabitable because of radiation contamination. In Turkey, where I was this autumn, they don't have a Clean Water Act. And because of that, the Marmara Sea has lost 300 species in the last 15 years. The Black Sea will be dead within 10. In Thailand, where I also was in this autumn, they don't have a Clean Air Act, and you can see people on any street in Bangkok wearing gas masks and particle masks. The New York Times recently reported that the average child in Bangkok who reaches the age of 6, Bangkok's a city larger than New York, 10.5 million people. The average child who reaches the age of 6 has permanently lost 7 IQ points because of the density of airborne lead contamination at ground level, because they didn't have a Clean Air Act that said you got to get the lead out of the gasoline. In China, where they don't have a Clean Air Act, they lose 100,000 people to smog every year, dead, children, elderly people, people with respiratory problems. One of the growth industries in Beijing is oxygen bars, where people literally go to buy a breath of fresh air. In Mexico City, if you own an automobile, you can legally only drive it 3.5 days a week. Smog inversions kill 10,000 people every year and shut down their principal state industries, sometimes for weeks at a time. In those nations, and many, many others, environmental injury has matured into economic catastrophe. And that's what would have happened here if we hadn't made that investment in the environment back in the 70s, and that's what will happen if we allow this foolhardy Congress to dismantle the investment that we've made today. And one of the things that I've done over the past 4 or 5 years is to constantly go around and confront this argument that an investment in our environment is a diminishment of our nation's wealth. It doesn't diminish our wealth. It's an investment in infrastructure, the same as investing in telecommunications or road construction. It's a price that you've got to pay if you want to ensure economic vitality for our generation and for the next. The other thing that they say, and I didn't mean to spend the whole time going after Congress, but actually it's a good use of time. The other thing that they love to say on Capitol Hill is that the reason that we need to get rid of these federal environmental laws is because we want to return control to the states. We want to have states' rights and community control, but what they really want, at least what the real effect of dismantling, that devolution of dismantling the federal laws will be, is not community control, it's corporate control. And we remember the Hudson Valley, the 1960s version of community control, when the General Electric Company could come into the towns of Glens Falls, Fort Edward, New York, and say to the town fathers, we're going to build you a spanking new factory and bring in 1,500 new jobs, and we're going to raise your tax base. And all you have to do is waive your environmental laws and let us dump our toxic PCBs into the Hudson River and persuade the state of New York to write us a permit so that we can do it. And if you don't do that, we're going to move to New Jersey. And Glens Falls took the bait, and a couple decades later, General Electric shut its doors, fired the workers, and left. And they left behind a $2 billion cleanup bill that nobody in the Hudson Valley can afford. And 1,000 commercial fishermen, my clients, who are now permanently out of work, because although the Hudson is loaded with fish, the fish are loaded with General Electric's PCBs, and they're too toxic to legally sell in the marketplace. And the barge traffic on the Hudson has dried up because the shipping channels are too toxic to dredge. And all of that land that General Electric occupied has now been, with tax breaks, has now been permanently removed from the tax rolls because nobody else is going to build there. And every woman between Oswego, New York, and Albany has elevated levels of PCB in her breast milk. And everybody in the Hudson Valley has PCBs, General Electric's PCBs in our flesh and in our organs. And the federal environmental laws were meant to put an end to that kind of corporate blackmail and to stop these corporations from coming in and whipsawing, bullying one community in New York against another in New Jersey, to get them, to force them to race to bottom, to lower their environmental standards, to recruit these filthy industries in exchange for the promise of a few years of pollution-based prosperity, and to ransom their children's futures in the process. And the federal laws gave us community control for the first time, because they allow us, if you look at any of the progressive social movements, or the women's movement, or the labor movement, or the civil rights movement, what they're meant to do is to disperse power, to spread out power among Americans and improve democracy and strengthen democracy. None of them has done it like the environmental movement has. Because anybody here, if somebody tries to build a landfill or an incinerator or a plastics factory or a roadway in your backyard and you really, really want to stop them, the chances are you can probably do it. If you really want to put your energies into it, you can force the proponent of that project to do a full environmental impact statement, disclose the costs and benefits to your community for the next generations. And you can demand a hearing, and you can cross-examine witnesses and direct examine, call your own witnesses, and you can demand a written transcript of that hearing and a decision by a judge on based upon a rational interpretation of that transcript. And if you don't get it, you can appeal to a higher court. And if there's a polluter in your backyard and the government fails to prosecute them, you can step into the shoes of the United States Attorney and prosecute that polluter for fines, $25,000 a day in injunctive relief. And there's these toxic inventories that you can demand of factories and government installations in your neighborhood, even if it's a government institution. Nobody else in the world has that power. If in Canada you don't like something the government does, they put an incinerator in your backyard, what is your remedy? You can wait for 3 years and vote the government out of office. In this country, you can actually participate in the community and in the process by which the destiny of your community is dictated, and really participate in a realistic way. And you may not always win, but you'll win a lot of the time if you engage in the battle. And that's democracy, and that's democracy that works. And democracy is awkward in the short term, and it's costly in the short term, but in the long term, it strengthens all of us, and it's the cheapest system that we have. And that's really what the environmental movement is about. It's about democracy. It's about grassroots democracy. And you know, the people who are fighting against us, they use on Capitol Hill again, they say, you know, that all of the arguments they use, you know, that it's property rights. It isn't. We have a right, nobody has a right to use their property in a way that is going to diminish or injure the use of and enjoyment of their neighbor's property, or community rights. And that's all that pollution is. It's not about property values. Or they say it's about the free market. But I'll tell you this, they don't want the free market economy. The best thing that could happen to the environmental movement is if we had a true free market economy. If you look around you, the most egregious environmental injury that we have in this country or anywhere else in the world comes not from the free market, but from the suspension of free market rules, from a fat cat who is using political clout to escape the discipline of the free market. And you show me pollution, I'll show you a subsidy. I'll show you somebody who has greased the skids and is getting something and not paying for it, who is getting something at our expense. You look at all the Western resource issues that have driven the environmental movement in this country over the past 3 decades. They're all about subsidies, about people getting water for 19 cents an acre foot when the true free market value is $800 an acre foot. From people being able to graze their cows and calves on our federal lands for way below the market price. From people being able to buy trees in our national forest that have a true value of $40,000 a piece for $1.89 a piece. And you and I spending $250 million a year building logging roads so that they can get up into our national forest and cut the last of our children's trees. And foreign mining companies coming onto our federal land and taking the minerals for free without paying for them. It's all about subsidies. It's all about somebody who doesn't want to pay the price of bringing a product to market. And that's what the free market's about. When General Electric dumped its PCBs into the Hudson River, it was avoiding one of the costs of production, which was to properly dispose of a dangerous process chemical that was part of the process of bringing its product to market. But when it avoided, and in avoiding that cost, it could expand its profit margins, it could outcompete its competitors, and it could pay big bonuses to Jack Welch and to the other CEOs. But when it avoided the cost didn't go away. They went into the fish, and they made the people sick, and they shut down the fishery, and they put the people on welfare, and they dried up the barge traffic on the Hudson River, and they took the land off the tax rolls. And all of those costs in a true free market should have been reflected in the price of the product when it got to the marketplace. But they were able to use chemical ingenuity and political clout to escape the discipline of the free market. And that's what all pollution is. It's somebody who's not willing to pay their way, somebody who has devised a way, who has out-clevered us and forced you and I to spend our money to finance or subsidize their production costs. And these guys, in the Hudson Valley in 1966, they weren't sophisticated people. They were smart. But they didn't know, they weren't that sophisticated, but they knew what this was. They said, this is an act of theft. They said the Constitution of the state of New York says that we own the Hudson River, the people of the state. The governor doesn't own it, the legislature doesn't own it, the fisheries department doesn't own it, and certainly General Electric doesn't own it. And the fishes belong to us, not the corporations of the government. They belong to the people. Everybody has a right to use them. Nobody has a right to use them in a way that's going to diminish or injure their use and enjoyment by others. This is ancient law. It goes back to Roman times, to the Code of Justinian. It's part of the Magna Carta. It's a critical part of our legal heritage. It's natural law, God-given law, that no human being or human-created institution could take away. In Roman times, if you were a Roman citizen, whether you were noble or humble or poor or rich, you had an equal right to go to the shoreline and take out a fish, and nobody could take more than their share. And nobody could deny you access to the shorelines or to the rivers. These were public trust assets, and that's still part of our common law in this country. And the people, and it's part of the constitutions in every state. The state of Massachusetts says the people of the state own the fish of the state. Nobody else owns it. Nobody can take it away from the people. And the Hudson Valley in Crotonville, New York in 1966, they were very much aware of that constitutional provision. And they said, this company is taking something that belongs to us. The Constitution says we own the fish. But we don't own them anymore. Penn Central has taken them away. They've used them up. They liquidated them for cash. And that's an act of theft. And they need to be treated as thieves. And they began hauling them off to court, and they began winning their cases. And they not only succeeded in saving the Hudson, but they generated this extraordinary wealth of environmental law that's now used by communities across America to defend their own rights in public trust assets. One last thing that I want to say, and it's the thing that I began with, which was, these people, the reason that I think this has been so effective, the Riverkeeper movement, is that these people understood from the beginning that the reason that we're protecting these assets, the fishes and the birds, is not for their sake, but it's for our own, because nature enriches us. Nature enriches us. It enriches us economically, yes, it's the basis of our economy. The economy is a wholly owned subsidiary of the environment, but it also, and we ignore that at our peril, but it also enriches us aesthetically and recreationally and culturally and historically and spiritually. And human beings have other appetites besides money. And if we don't feed them, we're not going to grow up. We're not going to fulfill ourselves. We're not going to become the kind of people that we're supposed to become. And it's particularly true for this country because so much of our culture, cultural heritage, and our identity as a people is tied up in nature. Our cultural and political leaders and spiritual leaders have told Americans from the beginning of time, you don't need to be embarrassed because you don't have the 1,500 years of culture that Europe has, because you have this connection with nature. and with the undiluted work of the Creator. And that's going to be the source of your virtues and your values and your character as a people. And you look around this room, we come from all over the place. What does it mean to be an American? We don't share any common culture or religion or race or color or language or history. How can we call ourselves a people or a community? Two reasons. Shared values, which is a commitment to our constitutional form of government, constitutional democracy, and the other is the land. That's what we have in common. And when we treat it with contempt, the message we're sending is that this is not really a community. This isn't really a nation. It's just a commodity. It's just real estate upon which a bunch of strangers have gathered to increase the size of their piles and then to move on. And the land is what we hold in common. And the way that we treat it is the best measure of how our democracy works. Because this is the bounties of the land and how they're distributed to their people, whether we allow a single group like General Electric to monopolize them, or whether we make sure that all the people have a right to their share of the fisheries. That's really the best measure of the democracy. And of course, the poor are hurt by environmental pollution worse than anybody. 4 out of every 5 toxic waste dumps is in a black neighborhood. The largest concentration of toxic waste dumps in America is the south side of Chicago. The most contaminated zip code in California is East LA. The largest toxic waste dump in America is Emile, Alabama, which is 85% black. The poor end up shouldering the burden of environmental injury through the destruction of resources which they have an ownership right, the monopolization of those resources, and through the distribution of toxics which always end up in their neighborhoods, and they end up shouldering the health burdens. But it's not an accident that we invented the national park in this country. We didn't have the great cathedrals and monuments of Europe to memorialize, and we chose to memorialize the handiwork of God. And it's part of our heritage. Nature, when we destroy nature, we diminish ourselves. We impoverish our children. We're not fighting to save those ancient forests in the Pacific Northwest, as Rush Limbaugh likes to say, for the sake of a spotted owl. We're preserving them because we believe that the trees have more value to humanity standing than they would have if we cut them down. And I'm not fighting to save the Hudson River for the sake of the shad or the sturgeon or the striped bass, but because I believe my life will be richer and my children's lives will be richer if we live in a world where there are shad and sturgeon and stripers on the Hudson, and where my children can see the men out in their boats and women in those little open boats doing what they've been doing for generations, and touch them when they come to shore to change their nets or repair them or to wait out the tides, and in doing that connect themselves to 350 years of New York State history and understand that they're part of something larger than themselves. They're part of a continuum. They're part of a community. I don't want my children growing up in a world where there are no commercial fishermen and where there are no family farmers and where we've lost touch with the seasons and the tides and the things that connect us to the 10,000 generations of human beings that were here before there were laptops and that connect us ultimately to God. And I don't think nature is God, and I don't think we ought to be worshiping it as God. But I do think it's the way that God communicates to us most forcefully. And this has been recognized. God is a metaphor for us. We can't describe him or her or it. And that's why the hymnists and the sermonists and the theologians throughout time have used nature as the clearest metaphor for who God is. The birds and the fishes and the bird songs and the rippling God, that's the only way God can be described. God communicates to us through many vectors, through each other, through organized religion, through the great books of those religions, through wise people, through art and literature and music, but nowhere with such clarity and texture and detail and grace and joy as through creation. And for me, therefore, destroying these things is the moral equivalent of tearing the last pages out of the last Bible or Torah or Talmud or Quran or Upanishad on earth. It's a cost that I don't think it's prudent for us to impose upon ourselves, and I doubt if we have the right to impose it upon our children. And that's really all that environmental advocacy is about. It's about recognizing we have a debt to our children and to the other members of our community who don't always participate in the political process, but who get burned when we use up more than our share of the environment. And that obligation to the next generation is expressed by the term sustainability. And all that word means is that God wants us to use the things we've been given, the bounties of the earth, to enrich ourselves, to improve our quality of life, to serve others. But we can't use them up. We can't sell the farm piece by piece in order to pay for the groceries. We can live off the interest. We can't go into the capital. We have to preserve value for the next generation. And what we do as environmental advocates is we elbow our way into those back hallways of Capitol Hill or Albany or Springfield or Boston, and with the big shots, big oil and big gas and big mining and big agriculture, and Philip Morris and General Electric are cutting up the pie with their indentured servants on Capitol Hill, and they're distributing it among themselves. And they're saying, here's the fresh air. Let's liquidate it for cash and stuff some in your pocket, and I'll stuff some in mine. And let's liquidate the fisheries and the fresh water and the things that belong to our children. And we go in and we say, we elbow our way into those tables and we say, we are emissaries for the future, and we demand an accounting. We want to know what you're doing with the things that don't belong to you, with things that belong to our children. And I will close with a proverb from the Lakota people that's been expropriated to some extent by the environmental movement, where they said, we didn't inherit this planet from our ancestors. We borrow it from our children. And I would add to that that if we don't return to them something that is roughly the equivalent of what we received, that they'll have the right to ask us some very difficult questions. Thank you all very much for your patience, and thank you for having me. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Ladies and gentlemen, we'll now open it up to questions. We have 2 microphones here, but before we do, I just wanted to quickly introduce Joe Kennedy, who has been the member of Congress from this district, and I assure you did not... The various references to Congress, I think, did not include Joe Kennedy, whom I personally know was not on that side of the issues. There may have been a time he needed some push from his brother, though. And I might just take a quick moment to say that most of the people in this room are quite familiar with the Institute of Politics, but their father was absolutely critical and essential in the creation of the Institute to see to it that there was a living memorial to President Kennedy, and it was one that really tried to engage people in the public process, and that's what the Institute of Politics tries to do. With that, let's turn to our questioners, and if you'll please quickly identify yourselves and ask a brief question in hopes that we can maximize the number of people that can participate.
Hi, thank you very much for that magnificent speech. Very inspiring. My name is Harpal Alberto Colli. I'm a freshman at the college, and from what I've read, many economists have suggested that the best way to protect the environment, given that corporations spend oodles of money finding loopholes to the regulations and fighting regulations in courts, is to make polluters pay for the right to pollute, given how much they pollute, and auction pollution rights. And I was wondering what you think of this change in the system and whether it's possible to implement it.
I wouldn't agree with that. I believe that pollution credits can be useful, but that I don't think that you can auction off a public right. People have a right to go down to the Charles and catch fish, and we don't know. I don't want a government official deciding that some polluter who wants to dump into the Charles River and is going to give some short-term economic benefits to the city of Cambridge or the city of Boston, that those rights or that benefit exceeds the actual rights of people who may not benefit from that payment to fish and to catch fish and to bring their children down to swim and to use that public resource for something other than liquidating it for cash. So I don't agree with that. I do think that pollution credits have a place, but they have to be limited. We need baseline standards that say that you cannot pollute in any way that's going to damage the environment or that's going to injure the public. And beyond that, we're going to give you pollution credits for further reducing pollution. But you need to start with the baseline. Otherwise, the credits themselves become a ceiling.
Thanks.
Hi, my name is Patrick Corsetto. I'm a freshman at the college. You listed all those environmental atrocities in places like Russia and Mexico and abroad. I was wondering, is there anything that the United States people and government can do to prevent those atrocities from happening more frequently, or can we just sit back and watch?
Most of those, the ones that I described, are choices by sovereign nations to either legislate or to not legislate. And I don't think there's really much that we can do about that. We can, what we can do is sign the Kyoto Agreement, which requires us to reduce our own pollution. And that not only gives an example, but it's also going to force technology. It will force the development of technologies in this country. For example, energy-efficient refrigerators and appliances, which once we build them here, because we're the biggest market in the world, we will then be able to sell them to the Chinese. It's in the Chinese own interest ultimately to reduce pollution. But if we start out by doing it here and develop the technologies, we're going to control the technologies, and they're going to be a major export industry for the United States. But also it's going to help other nations reduce without extracting immediate impacts or costs from their economies, which they feel they can't afford to make.
Upstairs? Up here?
Yes.
Amen, brother. I commend you. I want to especially commend you for the great work that you did with the Cree people of northern Quebec.
Thank you.
Which is where I first met you, actually, in the State House over in Boston. My name is James Williamson. I have a question, which is, I hear a contradiction in the way you presented the material, as fantastic as it was overall, which is, on the one hand, you say, here we got these great laws, but you're describing a situation where none of it seems to be working. And so what I'd like to hear from you is, what is wrong? What needs to be done? What needs to be changed? And then specifically, what needs to be done about GM? What needs to be done with Jack Welch? Should he be in jail? And perhaps he should be. And then, isn't the problem really fundamentally that we don't yet have the kind of democracy that I think you so eloquently were speaking to, which, were we to have a more real and genuine democracy, we could really begin to have the kind of power that you point to?
I think those are all legitimate statements and observations. If you want to know how to really change the country so that we get that kind of democracy, you got to get the money. You got to change the campaign contribution laws, because that really distorts all of democracy. And of course, a polluter. If you're making your money through pollution-based prosperity, if you're General Electric and you're dumping PCBs into the Hudson River and avoiding millions of dollars a year of investment into your plant, or if you're a lumber company like Alaska Pulp and Paper, which is 100% Japanese-owned, and you're cutting the Tongass National Forest, and you're paying $1.89 for trees that are worth $50,000 back in Japan, or if you're a Newmont Mining and you're mining, or American Barrick, which last year found a claim, a Canadian company, got $10 billion worth of gold on our public land in Nevada and paid a total of $5,000 of cash for it. If you are enjoying those kind of pollution subsidies, and it gets to the end of the year, and you have some money left over in your budget, what's the best thing that you can do with those dollars? Is it investing it in retooling your plant, retraining your workers, in research and development? No. The best investment is to give it to a congressman who's going to defend your subsidies, because there's nothing more effective that you can do from a financial point of view than make that investment for your dollars. And that's why we're having millions of dollars a year by the logging industry and by the big oil, big agriculture, big chemical, and they are dictating. That's distorting the political process in Washington, and it's stopping a lot of these laws, and it's continuing to finance this Congress, which is going to continue to try to take democracy away from us, the democracy of these environmental laws. Having said that, what we have in this country, what I think you're going to have all over the world, there's a direct correlation. The only form of government that protects the environment is democracy. The more democracy you got, the more environmental protection you're going to get, And if you look around the world, there's a direct correlation between nations that have environmental injury and low levels of democracy. High levels of tyranny always correlate with high levels of environmental destruction. Name the most tyrannical countries in the world, those are going to be the most environmentally degraded. The Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, China, Brazil, Saddam Hussein's Iraq. They always follow each other because the only thing that can protect the environment is democracy, and is an individual who says, I'm going to put my own interest aside and defend the interests of my children in fresh water and fishes and birds, et cetera. Because all of our inclination, the inclination of the political system is to liquidate the planet for cash, turn it into immediate cash to feed the constituents that keep them in office. That's the same thing that corporations do. So you need individuals who will not be swayed by the future whispers, the present shouts. And you need individuals. Democracy allows individuals who can hear those voices of the future and respond to them. And that's really what you need. Now, good environmental laws on a federal level do not necessarily mean you're going to have a good environment across the country. What you need is two things: good federal environmental laws and activist communities, leadership within the communities. And what you're going to see 10 or 15 years from now is a patchwork across this country and every other country of, if we maintain these good federal laws, they're going to give communities, maybe in the Hudson Valley, maybe Cambridge, and maybe Portland, Oregon, they're going to be able to have the power to protect their own communities, and they're going to be green, dignified, enriching places to live. And then you're going to have other communities who have a mining attitude, the conquistador attitude. We're going to come here, extract as much money as we can from our community. We're going to let them build the Walmart and the mall and the box stores over the landscapes that enriched us when we were children and could enrich our children. But we're going to take that immediate cash, and then we're going to leave. And you're going to have degraded communities on the one hand, and you're going to have rich, dignified communities on the other, depending on local leadership. And a lot of times it's just one person in the community who says, I'm going to give the leadership to this community to exercise my rights to protect it. And that's really ultimately what it's about.
What should happen to GM specifically?
Well, actually, we're about to file a law against, we have a corporate death penalty in New York State where corporations can, if they act against the public interest, can be deprived of their corporate charters. And we're about to file a petition asking that General Electric be revoked.
Great.
So, and we have a...
Hi, my name is Heidi Johanna Viertaler. I am so enamored with your work. I thank you so much for bringing your message for what we need to do for the future of our planet to the public in a way that people can relate to it. I'm deeply troubled with what's happened in Denver this last week. I'm a substitute teacher, and I think that we need to look at the cultures like the Cree and the Tibetans for the heart of compassion and for focusing our efforts on a spiritual focus in our lives and a compassion for the earth. And sorry, I'm not as articulate as I'd like to be right now. And I just think that, first of all, I want to throw out this question is, how can we get past the us versus them and the weak, a strong environment means a weak economy? And how can we get to a win-win situation? And I'd like to know also, I thank you from the bottom of my heart for all of your work to help bring attention to what's gone on in James Bay with the Cree and the Inuit. It's been a passion of mine since 1991 when I was at the Ban the Damn Jam in New York City.
Well, thanks. I think that the tradition you described about kind of living in harmony and recognizing that nature brings dignity to our communities, that's part of some of the Indian cultures and Tibetan culture. It's part of our culture too in this country. And we really, I think American history has two warring, polarized philosophies driving us, and they're driving each of our communities. And the first one is, the American national consciousness did not begin when John Smith landed at Jamestown in 1609 or the Pilgrims landed in 1628. It waited until 1630, and that's the year that Jonathan Winthrop came over, who was the Moses of the Great Migration of the Puritans, and to lands that they had fairly brought from the Indians, but to these, he gave this famous sermon called the Model of Christian Charity. He was standing on the deck of the sloop Arbella amidst this convoy of Puritans approaching the New World, and he pointed up at these verdant shores of New England with a richness that nobody in Europe had ever experienced before. They described the aroma of flowers that they could smell out of sight of land. And he said, God is giving us this land not as a gift, and not so that we can increase our carnal opportunities, or we can expand our own self-interest, or disappear, he said, into the lure of real estate. We're being given this land so that we can create cities on a hill. Examples to the rest of humanity about what human beings can accomplish if they maintain their focus on a spiritual mission. And although he was a white man and a Puritan, what he said that day was the core philosophy was adopted and integrated by every successive wave of immigrants that came into this country. And it differentiated the settlement of North America, the European settlement, from the European conquest of Latin America and Asia, where the Europeans came as conquistadors, as miners, driven by bald greed to extract the metals from the land, subjugate the people, level the landscapes, make themselves wealthy, and keep moving. In this nation, people came to put down roots and build communities. And that's really, until that philosophy about America was absolutely prevalent in this country until the gold rush of 1849, when a new vision of America became prevalent, which was the get rich quick, the conquistador version. And those two versions of what America means has been appealing for the loyalty of American souls, for all of our souls, for the rest of our history. And every major conflict throughout American history is driven by the tension between those two poles. And it's the way the rest of the world sees us. We did succeed in what Winthrop wanted, which we developed cities on a hill, examples to the rest of the world. The system that we developed here has become prevalent, and it is the best system. It's the most fair system, most just system, the only system that's able to harness the energies of all the diverse people of the earth to solve problems for the earth, which is democracy. It's the only thing that can save the environment too, as I said. But every conflict in American history, was the Revolution or the Civil War or Billy the Kid, is driven by those two conflicts between those two philosophies of who we are. And every one of us has to struggle with those two philosophies on our day-to-day basis to decide, are we going to be conquistadors today, or are we going to be community builders? Are we going to put down roots and try to build dignified, enriching communities that are sustainable for our children and for the next generation? Or are we just going to make ourselves rich and keep moving? And each community has to make that decision, and ultimately it's a struggle for the soul of our nation. But I believe that it's as much a part of our history and our culture. You know, the Hudson River School of Painters and the wonderful writers which celebrated nature in this country like no other country on earth, that's part of our culture as well. It's not just the Indian culture. It's part of who we are, but we have to struggle to make that the centerpiece of American destiny and not let the conquistadors, the people who are going to mine and exploit and liquidate our resources for cash and who don't care about the long term, who are only looking at the short-term benefits for themselves. They want to increase the size of their piles and then keep moving and leave behind a mess of failed relationships, failed communities, and a failure in history. And that's really, it's, each of us has to demonstrate leadership on those issues and continue to remind ourselves every day that we don't want to be the conquistadors, we want to be the community builders.
And what about James Bay?
About James Bay?
What's going on there now?
At this point, the good guys won, and the bad guys lost. And they're struggling with some other proposals about smaller damming projects, but the Indians are controlling their own destinies and their own communities.
Hello, my name is Matthew Bluestone. I'm a sophomore at the college. To go in a slightly different direction, I'd like to know what your thoughts are looking ahead at the field of environmental law, and especially the prospects for a student considering entering environmental law.
Environmental law, until a couple of years ago, was the fastest growing area of American law. It's still a fast growing area today. The easiest jobs to get are the corporate jobs, and they're the highest paying ones, in which, the kind of black hat jobs. The jobs that are less available and pay a lot less are the jobs for the environmental groups, but also there's a lot of government jobs available as well. So it's an area that has prospects, and if you're willing to make sacrifices, you can go to work for the environmental community if that's what you want to do. There are jobs out there.
Hi, my name's Nat Cohan. I'm a PhD student at Harvard. I actually wanted to go back to the question about what sort of touched on tradable permits, but although I don't think it was worded quite that way, it was the first question. And I just wanted to ask you if you could maybe share a few more thoughts about some of the programs that have been implemented or are being considered that would use a tradable permits approach to reducing pollution. I'm thinking in particular of the sulfur dioxide reductions under the Clean Air Act of 1990, which is, of course, is something close to your heart, I'm sure, as a New Yorker, given that effects of acid rain on the Adirondacks. And secondly, of carbon dioxide and the proposals to have a tradable permit system, perhaps at an international level, to control greenhouse gas emissions. Could you maybe talk a little bit about...
I think it's much more difficult, much more problematical, the proposals to attach that to the Kyoto Agreement, the international proposals, because there's just a lot less control and a lot of opportunity for cheating. I mean, there's whole industries, particularly in the former communist nations, that are collapsing, and that are collapsing anyway. The steel industry, which is one of the dirtiest industries, and in China, the same thing. And what would happen if you were able to have sulfur or carbon dioxide trading is somebody could take credit for the really horrible emissions from a plant that was closing down anyway, and at a plant, for example, in Siberia, a steel plant in Siberia, it's not causing that much environmental damage because it's not near human communities, and could trade that for carbon discharges that are, for example, much more populated centers in Eastern Europe or in Western Europe. And so that, I think, it becomes problematical. It's a little easier to do in this country, although, and I believe that we should do it. I think we should have, because otherwise, if you just have standards, if you just have a standard that says you have to reduce, to a certain amount of tons per steel unit produced, a certain amount of tons emitted, everybody's going to go to that tonnage, and they're not going to go any further. Even if for a relatively modest cost, you could substantially reduce your outputs, you still aren't going to do it because there's no economic incentive, unless you have some kind of trading scheme that allows you to make prudent choices and then take advantage of it economically. In water, I would say it's unworkable completely. Because it's all about local impacts, but I think there is a place for it in air pollution.
We want to thank very much Robert Kennedy today for an extraordinary speech here, and we want to thank him very much.
Doing pretty well. I finished with my internship today. What was that? I finished with my internship today at Captain Ivano's office.
Oh.
I'm finally done. Oh, yeah.
We don't hear anything about housing. I start to get nervous when I'm like getting a month away. You did, but women always do. How are you? How you doing? political speech. What's he running for?
I know, but